You might be wondering why I'm dressed like this. Well, it's Halloween, so I thought I would take a break from my regular costume of playing a mental patient incognito and be a cow. And that's just for today. And I'm still a little bit under the weather, but I have an hour before I have to finish getting ready for work. So I thought I would just talk. I'm feeling a tiny bit disconnected actually, and it's strange because this morning I was jumping on my trampoline, and then I was dancing to music with my headphones in, and then I felt a bit disconnected, and I feel like it's possibly because I go into this like celebration mode, which is even less ego than my normal waking consciousness. And even just sitting here and talking to myself on these videos, there's some level of ego consciousness there, but in that celebration state, it's not really necessary. And yet in that celebration state, it's not really possible to stay in that state all the time. So it's almost like going to a really good concert, and when you're in the concert it's just so good and enjoying it, and then when the concert's over you kind of have this little afterglow from the concert, plus you have this bit of sadness that it's over. And I don't know if it's sadness that that state's over as much as it just is a different state, and there's this felt difference, and it's almost like that bit of ego comes back in, and it's felt as kind of like discomfort. It's felt as like an intrusion almost, because it was so absent for that period of time. And so I just find it interesting because there was this other time that I was in total celebration mode, and I found a song that I really liked, and I was just so into it for like 2 hours. And then the next day I was, so-called really depressed. And I feel too it could be partly just the difference in feeling, of feeling nothing, not feeling a self, to having the self come back in. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. It's just something to notice and be aware of. And if I'm aware of it in that way, maybe I won't pathologize myself and think, like I'm gonna be going downhill. But at the same time, I do need to be aware, because I've talked about in other videos how I want to avoid the psych ward at all costs because of my previous experience. And so right now, because I feel a little bit kind of like discontent or something, it feels strange, I'll be even more watchful, because that strangeness invites a little bit of fear, and the ego is fear often. So it could just be the ego trying to reestablish a groove. I know the thing with mania is like a person is in that constant celebration state and they can't turn it off. And when it finally does turn off, a person goes through something like a psychosis. And to me, I just went into sort of that mini celebration state for a short period of time, maybe like half an hour or so. And so there's like this mini come down, this mini like feeling, like just like coming off a drug, and my body was making its own inner neurotransmitters and things to reflect that state of celebration. And when those are withdrawn through not being in that mode anymore, through kind of coming back to more of a regular consciousness, there's a sense that is going away. So in manic consciousness or mania, it's like maybe somebody's in that state for a month or longer, and so the come down is absolutely astronomical. And so I just felt that, I think, on a mini scale, and it's not necessarily a sign of illness. It's just the body having a different sensation from that state of celebration and then coming back to regular consciousness. And people do that even in a regular basis. They feel a bit better and then they feel a bit worse, just in regular consciousness, and then they try to do something to make themselves feel better. Well, I was just doing something that made myself feel really good, jumping on my trampoline and dancing, listening to music, and then when I stopped that, those neuropeptides are withdrawn from the body, and I feel a little bit of a withdrawal in a way. And now that's not to say, oh, I need to go jump on my trampoline and dance to that music 24/7, because if I did, it no longer would actually be that great, because I'd be habituated to it. So that celebration state is pretty, special, but I think I could probably work towards being in it more. And I do want to move towards that, move toward being in that state more. And I don't think it's really anything different than just embodying the inner dimensions of being a human being versus embodying the inner, dividing up bits of the ego, which are not that. So I don't think it's special. I think doing that little trampoline and stuff was actually just one way of being in that celebration mode, just laughing and sharing and being a certain way in daily life is also that too. It doesn't have to require going to extremes to actually feel that. And maybe I went too far in a way, and then maybe I'm feeling it and I'm like, okay, that's a little bit too far away from just how my life is designed right now. And when I was experiencing that, I kind of had this sense that, maybe the highest level of my life for me is actually moving towards being like a DJ or something, because then people are celebrating and dancing and having fun, not really sitting here and talking. Like I could sit here and talk for the next 10 years, or I could be a DJ and watch people dance. And which is more powerful? I think being a DJ. So I feel like I'm in this phase where I want to like talk about stuff with myself, but then I'll get to a point where hopefully I'm not really talking about it and I'm embodying my celebratory nature more. And I still do a lot of stuff in my daily life, but I'm wondering, like right now I work 2 jobs, and one of them is going to be closing up soon, and I feel like I could utilize that time to move towards actually embodying some of the stuff that I'm talking about. And when I was in Manic Consciousness the first time, I was just fully embodying that and living that way for an entire month. And it did get very chaotic, because it went on for 2 months actually. And I feel like I can embody that in bursts in my life. I read a study that talked about doing random acts of kindness for 2 hours a week in like a 2-hour chunk is good for you. So I could do that. And those are ways of doing it in a controlled way, because for me, it could actually get out of control. So I could say, do too much kindness and then lose my habit and routine that's required to remain employed and actually feed myself. So there's a balance, and I feel maybe one day all of that will be a part of my life and I won't have the other stuff to worry about, but I don't know. It doesn't really matter either way. But I guess it's about lifestyle design and designing in happiness first, which I talked about in a video somewhere. Whereas putting happiness first, because if I'm happy, I'm going to do things differently in my life. So if I think of happiness, I'd be pretty happy if I was a DJ or producing music and I knew how to make electronic music and I was enjoying it, and other stuff, rebounding, rollerblading, all that fun stuff. And that's all fine and dandy, but it's also about the world centricity, because I could go off into my own personal happiness tomorrow and it could even still turn out the same way in the end. It might not matter. All paths, supposed paths, could still lead back to the same thing, because it's all here and now. But and I came to so many. My little reminder popped up and it says, "You have a voice reminder. Are you scared of showering?" And I notice I'm a little bit hesitant to shower these last couple days because I feel maybe lazy or something, which means I'm kind of maybe overthinking things or something, but I'm not afraid to shower, so I'm okay. But I'm still extra watchful of myself because I could take a Seroquel, not because I feel like, oh, I'm getting ill, it's just to slow me down. Like, that stuff makes a person sluggish and dull. And, if I took it every day, I would probably gain weight and be even more sluggish and dull. And, that dullness would be mirrored in my body, in my flesh. I'd be this big blob. And it's sad that people are turned into that through no fault of their own. But being prescribed to take it. And so I could take that to slow me down, not necessarily to fix any kind of like mental illness or something. And that's why I say I'm a mental patient incognito on a daily basis, because I actually feel that my brain sort of computes things faster than society is designed for. So there's no real place for me to go except to being dulled with medications under the umbrella of being mentally ill, because I recognize patterns, and I recognize the pattern of humanity that is super destructive, and I would probably destroy myself reacting to that, because I would have no sense of self to stop me from doing that, and I would be kind of like a kamikaze pilot in my own body. So that's not really, it's not really great. This medication kind of buys me time to see if, it's almost like, to see if I can create my life in such a way that it's in alignment with the way my brain wants to work. Because my brain wants to work in a way that's not in alignment with society. So I need to work towards creating my life in a way in alignment with the way my brain is going to work. So, for example, if I'm going to have a brain that's like super weird and fast, and I don't even know, like, I'm not saying it's better, it's just different. You could think it's actually worse, because then it makes it very difficult to function in this society, and then I have to take toxic medications, which eventually damage my body and kill me. And people take medications for mental illness actually die 25 years earlier. So this isn't necessarily a better thing, it's just different. So what I'm saying is that as I have 25 years less to live, technically, I need to move towards creating a life where actually I might buy myself more time of that 25 years that I've technically lost by being put into the mental health system. And so part of lifestyle design would actually be to live somewhere quiet. And right now I live on a really, really busy street, and it's noisy. You can probably hear the cars going by. So somewhere quiet and peaceful, which also includes not having people upstairs stomping around and having the TV going on, because my brain is really sensitive to noise. And also maybe being a little bit removed from society, so I can put myself in it in small dosages and not get overwhelmed by it because of what I see. And so right now I take medications on a daily basis, but I can imagine maybe if I was in a more quiet area that's more designed for my brain, then maybe I wouldn't need the medications to dull me, because there wouldn't be those things that are bothering my brain happening, like all this engine noise and noise of society. And that's the thing too about going into that celebration mode, coming back here and then thinking, oh, I have to work today and I work tomorrow at my other job, and it's like this society or this stuff that I participate in relating to the mental health system becomes less inspiring. So it's kind of like, oh, whereas maybe a couple days ago I was like into it and it was inspiring. It's still inspiring to me, but I'm just saying that with that sort of difference, I might notice that it's not quite as inspiring as it is when viewed from a different level. It's not quite as inspiring. And there's a place in life for all levels, that's for sure. It could even be showing me that I would like, or I have within me to move towards that. And I think there's a little bit different. I think there's a difference between planning to do something and really seeing and perceiving the possibility of that unfolding. So seeing the potentiality, seeing what I am a seed to possibly unfold as my life. And I can keep unfolding my life as society is pressuring it to unfold, or I can unfold it in a way that would be congruent with my wildest dreams that I was born with as a baby. So I actually heard a quote one time, is that if you don't create your own structure, you become a victim to other people's structures, like other people's systems and other people's ways of being, or so it's something about creating that structure, and I do want to create a structure for people to go through their distress, and also possibly go from dullness to wellness and reduce reliance on medication while staying safe, of course. Like, safety's number one for sure. And so the insights I had, I've had so many insights, and I write them down. There's so many, and I can't keep up, and I don't think it really matters to talk about them per se. But when I was editing a video yesterday, I had this sense that the ego lacks euphoric sensation, or the ego is this field of euphoria, and I'm probably not saying it correctly, or illustrating it exactly correctly, but what I was thinking was how Dr. Daniel Siegel said that when we have trauma, we don't encode it properly in the brain. The memories aren't encoded properly in the brain. So when it comes up again in the present, it lacks euphoric sensation. So we have sort of this, we're re-experiencing the trauma, but it's not actually happening now. And we don't realize it's not happening now, so we're terrified. If we actually realized it wasn't happening now, we wouldn't be terrified, likely. But it feels like it's happening now. And now, that's called lack of euphoric sensation. And what happens is the hippocampus shuts down during trauma, and I believe he talked about how that's because of the high amount of cortisol. So high amount of stress shuts down the hippocampus, and then the memories aren't encoded in the brain properly. And I talked about in a video how I think they get stuck in the heart, in the pattern of the heart, because the heart is beating in a certain way when we're being traumatized, and that's sort of vibrating and storing all those memories in our body and our cells, and they're not properly processed in our brain. And so what I'm thinking is how we record hurts, ego memory hurts, like somebody saying something to us, or something our mom said to us when we were young. And to me, that's just a mini trauma. It's like a mini hurt. And so if you think about it, when the hippocampus, you could think about it as the hippocampus not working properly still. So maybe it's not completely shut down, or mostly shut down, like when one is having a very traumatic experience. But the hippocampus doesn't allow that memory or that happening to just pass right through it and just go into oblivion. Like most things that we perceive just go through us and into nothingness, because we don't need to remember every tiny little bit of information. So for some reason, well, it's mainly because we have this ego image which to me, I feel it's like it starts out as a little speck, or I don't know how it starts, but say it starts out as a speck, this ego image. And that speck got there because the hippocampus didn't let the speck go through. And we keep this speck, this memory, and we kind of think that it has something to do with us. So we think it's us. And then next time something happens that is this little hurt, we record it. And we record it and keep it because it didn't pass through the hippocampus and go into oblivion. So it accumulates with this little bit of the ego image. So we start off with one bit, and then we end up with maybe 1,000 memories or something, and we consider this our ego complex of something your boss said to you, or something your teacher said to you, or something you did that you weren't happy with. And those are all things we choose to record and remember because it didn't actually just go right through and go into oblivion. And the thing too is it can go into the brain, and we do recall this ego image thing as past. We realize, in a certain sense, we realize that's something that happened in the past, but at the same time we don't realize it's something that happened in the past because we take it as this ego me that we are. So I feel that the ego complex is actually lack of euphoric sensation. It didn't pass through and go, oh, that was past, like gone, done. Nothing to do with the present moment. So this accumulation of images that are just each mini traumas, and even if it's a good memory, it's still kind of a trauma because it's something we're holding on to. You know, it's almost like I have to hold on to this because if I don't, it's not going to even out the bad stuff. So it's like fear. Even these happy memories are fear because we're trying to overcompensate for this bad stuff in there. And we try to draw upon those to make us feel pleasure when the other ones come back and make us feel pain. But again, to me, it's all past image, thought, memories, which accumulate and form this ego, which we think is healthy. But to me, it's just accumulated trauma, but it's low level, so we don't actually see it as trauma. We see it as, this is me, this is something that happened to me. But it's sort of accumulated trauma memory stuff. And he talks about something called allostatic load, which just means kind of like how much stress we've accumulated. And to me, the ego is the allostatic load. It's all these little bits that we've accumulated, like plaque, like just this mold growing inside of us. And then a person, some people are more, supposedly resilient than others. And then this ego is the allostatic load, and then if something traumatic happens, it's like boom, a person is pushed over the edge because they've already accumulated so much of this allostatic load that if something happens, it's like it pushes a person over the top of trauma. And it's like the hippocampus is trying to deal with this allostatic load, and there's nothing it can do with it now that it's this accumulated mass. And so if this trauma comes in and adds to that big time by the hippocampus shutting down totally, it just makes the allostatic load even bigger, and it's almost like this allostatic load of the ego now has this greater fear pattern of the trauma to sort of navigate in. So now this ego allostatic load has the context of this trauma happening, and it's actually moving within this just complete terror and fear. And this complex of memories is the thing that's afraid. The body in actual space has nothing to be afraid of. So it's like this image complex of allostatic load reacting to that sort of hippocampus insult of trauma that just creates more context of fear through which this ball of fear can move in. And that goes along too with sort of how the ego is like this allostatic load of cortisol, kind of, in a way. And And the cortisol, it attacks the hippocampus, and when the hippocampus doesn't allow things to pass through, it records that image. And when we record all these images and sounds and thoughts inside and keep them there instead of letting them pass through, that ego me complex is actually in our inner field, our mind screen, our inside pattern recognition area, and it's clogging it up so we can't recognize patterns. And when there's this ego me allostatic load moving around and clogging that up, it's harder for us to be in the actual human dimensions of, for example, being able to perceive truth, beauty, love, joy, celebration, laughter, all these things that require that our inner perception, our inner quantum computer be clear. It's like we have this inner quantum holographic processor that recognizes patterns, that recognizes interference patterns. And if we're actually seeing and perceiving with that clean slate, we're acting in a congruent way with what is out there. And by acting in that congruent way with our inner quantum holographic light processor, we're able to unfold that which is actual. Because by just reacting to the ego allostatic load, energy, thought, sound complex, we're not acting in congruence with what's actually there. We're reacting to stuff that's going on inside that was recordings from the past. So that's the thing. The ego lacks euphoric sensation. We don't actually notice that the ego are just past recordings. We take it to be ourself, because each time an image doesn't pass through the hippocampus properly, it's like an injury. It's like being poked each time that happens, and so the ego is just kind of like accumulated scar tissue of the things that didn't pass through, that we didn't allow to pass through it, that we keep with us for some reason, and then we allow that to damage our perception and alter how we act in reality, because we're looking through those images and we're seeing those images everywhere. We're superimposing those patterns of those hurts onto external reality, and they don't always fit perfectly, but they're close enough to resonate and make us react to those past images, and we're not seeing what's really there. And that's a thing too that I thought of quite a while ago, was how the ego, or that thought complex going on, is sound. And so it's almost like the ego is like the recording of those images and sounds, and then by recording those images and sounds, we create this image of ourselves with our own voice, which is sound. So we have this image sound version of ourselves inside ourselves, supposedly reporting on what's happening, but it's not actually reporting on what's happening. And so if you think about that image sound ego thought complex, and just imagine it was completely gone and it was just blank, no sound, no image. Now the light realm within us, this processor within us, this perception, the light of our perception is clean, and so we can actually see and we can actually hear what's happening outside of us and see what's happening outside of us, because we don't have this inner vision blocker and sound blocker going on inside of us. And I actually feel that, those image sounds, those images and those sounds, those recordings that we have, that we allow to accumulate as allostatic load, as like a complex of images and thoughts that we take to be ourselves, take to be our identity, those are actually creating cortisol. So those are actually creating stress, which damages the hippocampus, which allows for more recordings to accumulate, and it's difficult to let go. And And so I feel that this inner sound is actually sort of stress. It's cortisol. This voice in our head is damaging our hippocampus. It's like it's brain damage. The voice in our head is brain damage. When we record somebody else's voice saying something to us, or their image saying something to us, we're actually damaging our brain because it's staying in there. And it's damaged because why are we choosing to record that when maybe we could just go and just record flowers the rest of our life, and that's all that would be in our brain is flowers. And so we're looking for these supposed dangers when if we record it, that's the danger, because it's going to continue to damage our brains, as we're going to be looking for similar things. We're going to be looking for that, as that's what's going to be salient. And so, it's another person's ego, and we're making their ego salient in our brain, and we're creating our ego based on other people's egos. And when we get struck in those moments of awe, and that all disappears, those moments of awe are when that thought image is suspended temporarily. So when Dr. Daniel Siegel talks about trauma as being lack of euphoric sensation in a way, I actually feel the ego is mini trauma accumulated, and it's also euphoric sensation that if we were able to be attentive, we wouldn't record things because we would know there's a danger in recording that. We would have that awareness beyond that. And if we were residing in our radical subjectivity of the subjectivity of humanity, of what it is to be a human being, we would be residing in either beauty, truth, love, goodness, laughter, lightness. And so we would see the falseness of taking something on personally. By taking stuff personally, we create our ego person self. And I feel the ego actually damages the hippocampus with the stress and the cortisol, and the stress of trying and becoming and trying to become psychologically better, when everything within the realm of the ego and the psyche is of the same quality, which is not a very high quality. And apparently fish oil repairs the hippocampus. And I feel too that if, like, I have a past traumatic history, and if I am stressed, it has a tendency to arise, and it could arise when my hippocampus is being damaged in daily life, and maybe it can't keep up. Just like if the liver is overloaded and can't keep up, the reason we get intoxicated by alcohol is because the liver can't keep up with the processing. If we could drink as much alcohol as we possibly could and the liver could keep up, we wouldn't feel drunk. So in the same way, the drunkenness of the trauma can arise if the hippocampus gets overloaded. And I feel like that's part of how people can get mixed up with the collective unconscious too, because there's personal trauma, and then below that, or at a different level, is the trauma of humanity. And I feel like we can even resonate with that if our hippocampus, it could be the same sort of lack of ekphory. It could be all the memories recorded in the human brain of any brain anywhere at any time. J. Krishnamurti says that there's only one human brain, it's not separate brains. And I haven't really seen the truth of that fact that he mentions, but if it's true, then we could have access to anything. And to go with that, we're actually afraid of our own recorded images. So the images inside get in the way of seeing clearly. That light inside of us that creates all these ego images is actually the light of perception, and that's the light of perception we use to sort of take impressions of the patterns we see outside. And everything we see outside of us, when we look at it clearly, it makes this impression on our inner light quantum processor. That mind screen that we have, it impresses our mind screen, but we're busy making up all these dramas and tales about our recorded images of our ego consciousness, and so we can't see these patterns clearly. The ego images are like running way too many programs on your computer at one time and then trying to do movie editing. The computer is probably not going to be able to do all of it, and the editing is going to be slow and choppy, and it's going to take forever, and you're going to get frustrated. So when the mind screen inside is clear, that light of perception, we see and understand things differently, and we act differently based on that understanding. And when we act through perception, understanding, action, which pretty much happens simultaneously, we unfold a different world. Most of us spend our life reenacting old images in our own internal mind screen, which is creating the cortisol, which is damaging the hippocampus, which is causing more of an accumulation, which is causing more stress. And by looking at those images on our mind screen and those thought sounds, that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the past. We're living in the past. We're replaying the past. And when we're doing that, we can't see possibility. We can't see patterns. We can't understand what's happening. And when we're seeing and understanding, we're learning, and we feel there's this self-sufficiency in that process, and we don't feel dependent on so much in order to actually get through life. And when we perceive from this place of seeing patterns, it actually repatterns our brain. And when we're seeing patterns, we're not seeing through our ego, so we're not recording things that are reinforcing our ego. We're just seeing what is actually there and the pattern of it. So the ego is actually a perception problem. It's inattention. It's an avoidance strategy. It's avoiding living, and that's what society is designed for. And by seeing possibility, we unfold those possibilities, and we make what is possible probable. And our image-making process, our recording process, our ego has written over our quantum holographic processor, the pattern recognizer, the seeing and the understanding. This is the way we saw as children. It's like having a child's eyes again. Be as a child to whatever, heaven or something. There's nowhere to go. It's just a different way of seeing. Usually we try to learn and understand just by adding another image, another memory to our ego structure. I was watching a little bit of a video on intermittent fasting, and the very first time I went to manic consciousness, I had been raw vegan for 10 months, and that's kind of like fasting. And then I was unable to hold food down properly during the process too, and I went down to just 90 pounds. But the point is that fasting kind of gets us into that state. And I think too that a lot of our food actually feeds our pleasure complex, which is our ego wanting pleasure. So by fasting sometimes, it can actually decouple us from this reliance on pleasure, because most eating is for pleasure. I used to eat only for nutrition. Now I'm enjoying my Indian food and stuff, but actually recently when I was in the hospital and they were giving me a really potent toxic drug that I didn't want, I actually naturally responded by just eating half of my meals. And it made me a bit hungrier, but I felt like by eating less, it would be less toxic to my system. My liver would have less food to process, less food to digest, less energy wasted in food. And also I knew that the pill would make me hungry, so by going against how I thought it was going to make me feel, I was having some level of, say, control over the medication's effects on me. Because if one of the things it does is wants me to make me gain weight, and I'm not gaining weight it's not going to have, the medication is not going to have the same effect, because I feel actually part of the effect of the medication is that we have so much more fat on our body. It's like an insulator for all the cellular memories that we're experiencing. So all those memories that didn't pass through us, through our hippocampus, and just go into wherever in the brain, or the oblivion thing, they're stored in our body and our cells. And when we're in distress, that's sort of coming out, and it's the lack of ecphoric sensation because it's actually stored in the body. But by making us get all fat, it's sort of insulating that process. I think it actually creates, like, kind of like the brain is made of fat, it creates like a fatty brain around our whole body to sort of protect us. So that's one of the ways it actually insulates us from these thought images that are coming up. And that's what psychosis is like scary thoughts and images, inside, outside, wherever. It's all over the place. Well, that's what we've been collecting our whole lives, and that's the scary stuff. And I actually feel like even just the ego is mini psychosis. It's hallucination. It's not anything that's there, and then it gets to a certain point, the allostatic load of the ego gets to a certain point, and then it's called psychosis because someone's behaving strangely. But a person with their little mini psychosis ego is behaving normal, but if their thoughts were being projected to everyone, they'd probably be arrested, because what they're actually thinking is really scary, probably, or not very nice. And so, you can even just think of it that way. Like, would you want somebody to hear your thoughts? If not, it's kind of like psychosis. And I feel any level of thought in one's head is psychosis, because the ego is just a thought image complex that we've built up over time through not allowing stuff to pass through us and recording it to keep it for later in order to react to what the other images of what we think people are doing and saying based on our memories. So we're not actually relating to reality whatsoever. So I say the ego is psychosis. And so even psychiatrists with their egos thinking have psychosis. So for me, if I was ever in the system again where they want to like drug me up and stuff, I would probably eat way less. I already have my representation agreement to protect me and my advance directive, but if that didn't work for some reason, I just wouldn't eat, and that would help my body process that toxic garbage and not put all this fat on my body. Krishnamurti talks about how thought is in action and how perception is action. So actually seeing something is the doing. Perception is action. And to me, thought is an action, because supposedly acting based on thought, is reenacting the ego. It's something from the past. So it's not action. It's acting or reenacting based on this image structure inside of us on our mind screen, which is actually just like blinders. And that's the thing, only perception is necessary. We don't have to do anything. And I think that's how fasting can weaken the ego thought me image complex, is that it's a decision not to indulge pleasure. And I feel like when I've been in, supposed psychosis, by eating less, I'm not indulging that ego structure, so it's making it a little bit easier to deal with the distress that is coming up. I feel like the ego is busy making like pleasure and pain molecules in the body, and that's our inner reward system. That's our inner Pavlov's dog. The ego is just like Pavlov's dog, and each time we think of something or have an image, it's like one of those little bells ringing and we start to salivate. Like pleasurable thoughts are the little bell, and we start to salivate our little dopamine or pleasure neuropeptides. If we were actually perceiving and acting in the moment, there would just be joy in being a human being. There would be no need for this pleasure reward for escaping the moment, because the moment supposedly sucks because we've moved so far off the path of perception and action. And I think food helps us make these pleasure molecules because we're pleased by the taste, plus just the crap in it actually makes it so we want more of this pleasure molecule stuff. And I feel like the brain and the body can't repair itself properly. So if we're super, super stressed with the cortisol attacking our hippocampus, but we're using food as pleasure to sort of pacify that, it's not actually making the cortisol go away. It's just sort of pacifying us with this pleasure that happens at the same time. So no wonder our bodies are made up more of cortisol, maybe pleasure molecules, dopamine, whatever they are, and those neuropeptides, or say we get angry and then we do something to pacify the anger. Now our body's made up of all those neurochemicals and neuropeptides. Well, no wonder we can't go into that flow state with those 5 neuropeptide combination that makes us feel flow. Well, how can we feel flow when we're doing this ego image, pleasure, dopamine reaction to the past thing? And that's implying that we're reacting to the past. All this biochemistry is actually us living in the past, which isn't now. So it's sort of an adjustment, it's a contortion, it's a distortion from the actuality, and no wonder we're not in the field of gravity properly and we're not flowing properly. And the brain needs to repair itself from being hijacked by pleasure. If we have clear perception, we don't need pleasure. And that's the thing, in those hyper-perceptive states, we can recognize patterns. We can recognize the pattern of society and what it's doing to us as humanity, and what it's done to us as humanity. It's just an extrapolation. It's pretty obvious. And if we really saw clearly, we would wake up and we wouldn't participate in this anymore. So society has a vested interest in keeping us blinded by our own egos. We must become immune to the thought, ego, sound, image, past structure, which is tied into pleasure and pain and fear. I actually feel that this trauma releasing exercise shakes off some of that. So might fasting. So I had this thought today. Don't be yourself, because who you think you are is not you. We are the universe. We are one self. What we are is something, just a common humanity. And I drew another picture. This is a good one. So that is me, and then the little ego speaking in the head, and it's telling us, it's trying to be our guide, and it's a really crappy guide. And then there's the actual self, and the ego is collapsing crappy wave functions that aren't really real because they're collapsing inside and they're old thoughts. So we're collapsing the past within us, and through that we're collapsing ourselves. We're not expanding into our possibility. We're being engulfed by our past image recordings that we decided to record. When we have our iPhones now and stuff, we don't choose to like take a picture of dog crap. We actually take pictures of beautiful moments to remember. Yet our brain, it has no, I'm not saying we should record at all with our brain. We shouldn't necessarily. The equivalent of what we do is like taking a crap and every day taking a picture of our crap and like worshiping that or something and thinking that we are that piece of crap in the toilet. And not only that, we're actually just the picture of the piece of crap in the toilet that we took. It's obvious that we're not that. Like, how can we be so blind? Anyways, this is getting long. Have a great Halloween, and until next time, don't be yourself. Be the universe. A few things I saw on the way to work. I was thinking about how most people are sort of like in their head when they're driving, because the activity of driving has become a habit. It's been trained into us. And in the same way, our whole lives have become habits. So when it's habitual, what we're doing, brushing our teeth, washing our hands, doing whatever, it doesn't require our conscious attention. It doesn't require presence, so we're lost in our own fantasy world. But why have we made being in this human body into a habit? And then we go off into our heads, into these images and stuff of past situations instead. And how can that experience be better than actual reality. But since we become these habits, it has become better than actual reality. And then I was driving and I was listening to ABBA because they're going to be reuniting or something. And then I had this memory flash in my mind where my dad picked me up from school and he was like blasting some kind of like, in my mind, cheesy music. And I like kind of yelled at him to turn it down, like, because I was embarrassed. It was high school. And I was thinking about that and how I could have maybe responded with love and not cared that that happened. But then it just popped in my head that maybe since my brain doesn't operate in that ego image realm all the time, though memories do flash in my consciousness, but I'm not operating in past memory stuff all the time. I was wondering if it's almost like a life review during my life. I wonder if my life will sort of flash before my eyes throughout my life instead of having what some people experience at the end of their life, which is seeing their whole life flash before their eyes. And then when that happens, they're like, wow, I barely lived life because I lived in all these images. But since I'm living in actual reality, I just have mostly actual reality, and then I have little flashes of memories, and so it just made me think that most people live in their memories all the time and in their ego, like when they're driving, when they're washing their hands, anything they do habitually, and they're not actually here present. And only in being here present are we able to not record images and not live in those images. Only in the present moment. The images and the memories in the past are dividing us from the present moment. They're creating a false division because we're not actually divided from the present moment. And I also thought what I was talking about with the going into celebration consciousness and coming back, I feel like sometimes too, when I see something very clearly, when I perceive something and understand it, part of my ego or part of myself actually has to die. Part of this image domain has to die. And those images dying feels kind of strange. And also too, when I was driving, I was thinking about if I ever become a music producer or something, I'll create a song saying, this is not a recording. This life is not a recording. It's not the images we've recorded in our head. Kind of like a play on the answering machine thing we used to have. This is a recording.